Hello. Today we will talk about the Church's unity. This unity belongs to the very essence of the Church. Let me put it in Latin words. The Church's unity is not just the well-being, bene esse, of the Church. It is its very being, esse. Without unity, the Church does not exist, cannot exist. Wherever is the Church, there is the unity, and vice versa. Wherever is the unity of Christians, there is the Church. The unity, however, was understood in different ways in different periods of the Church's history. For example, in the imperial times, in the time of the Roman Empire, after this empire converted to Christianity in the 4th century, the unity of the Church was perceived in the same terms as the unity of the empire was seen. To a great extent, the Church was identified with the empire, and the preservation of the unity of the Church was perceived by many political figures, by the emperors, as a task to preserving the unity of the empire. When this empire began collapsing and the western part of this empire fell, the idea of the Church's unity evolved as well. And in the West, the Church unity was perceived now as unity with the Bishop of Rome. This was particularly a feature of the perception of the Church's unity during the Middle Ages. In our days, the Church's unity is perceived as Eucharistic communion primarily, when communities and churches can participate together in the liturgy, in the Eucharist. This means that they are in unity. When they cannot participate together in the Eucharist, this means that they are not in unity. To understand what unity means, and therefore what disunity means, we need to go back to the history and to analyze very briefly the instances of disunity, the instances of the fragmentation of Christianity. I would identify three large waves of fragmentation of the global Christianity. The first wave occurred in the 5th century, following the two ecumenical councils, one in Ephesus in 431 and another one in Chalcedon in 451. Those councils discussed the Christological issues. They tried to interpret the way how God became a human being, how God became incarnated. There was a disagreement, particularly among the Christians in the East, about the interpretation of the incarnation. And these disagreements led to the fragmentation of the Eastern Christianity, so that two patriarchates, Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in the East, in Syria, disagreed with other two patriarchates of the time, Rome in the West and Constantinople in the East, on the issues of the incarnation. This led eventually to the first great schism. On the one hand, there were the churches of Rome and Constantinople who supported the Council of Chalcedon and interpreted the incarnation as Christ being one hypostasis of the Logos in two natures. On the other hand, the patriarchates, the majority of the patriarchates of Alexandria and Antioch, did not accept the idea that Christ had two natures, and they believed and insisted that Christ, we can speak about only one nature in Jesus Christ. There was also a faction of the Patriarchate of Antioch in eastern Syria that insisted that Christ had only two natures and he had two personalities, to put it in modern terms. That group of Christians constituted the so-called the Church of the East. They were expelled from the Roman Empire. They found themselves in the Persian Empire, and they developed further. They grew further as a community to the east, to the Central Asia and Eastern Asia. They spread as far as to India and China. So that's how Christianity became fragmented in the 5th century. This fragmentation, as I mentioned, occurred primarily in the Christian East. Then a second fragmentation, the second wave of fragmentation occurred in the 11th century approximately. It epicentered in the 11th century when the former allies, the churches of Rome and Constantinople, disagreed on a number of issues, including the issue of primacy, how to interpret the primacy in the church. They disagreed to the extent that they decided not to to continue to be in communion with one another, unfortunately. They separated from each other in the 11th century formally, but this separation started quite earlier, maybe in the 8th or 9th centuries, and it continued up to the early modern era. It was finalized only in the 18th century when the two churches decided that they cannot be in communion with one another. They cannot receive each one's members without rebaptizing them, which was a very unfortunate decision on both sides. So the schism, the second great schism between East and West, lasted several centuries before it was finalized and reached its peak, its culmination in the 18th century. This is essentially the division, as we put it now, between the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. This is, however, a second great schism. It's not the only one, not the only great schism that occurred in the history. So we see that the first great schism occurred mostly in the Christian East. The second great schism occurred between the East and the West. And the third great schism occurred primarily within the Western Church, in the Western Church in the 16th century. We know this fragmentation of the Church as the Reformation. The Reformation had its rationales, which are to a great extent justifiable, because indeed the Reformation tried to tackle the issues growing in the period of in that period of time. At the same time, with all its good intentions, it led to the fragmentation of the Western Christianity. And roughly speaking, it led to the formation of the Catholic Church as we know it now, and the churches of the Reformation, the Lutheran, the Reformed churches, and other churches that sprang from them, including the evangelical churches, the Methodist churches, Presbyterian churches, which are numerous in the United States of America. So those are three large waves of fragmentation that modern ecumenical movement has to deal with nowadays. The purpose of the modern ecumenical movement is exactly to bridge those divides, those schisms, to overcome them, and to restore the unity of Christianity. The ecumenical movement started approximately a century ago, in the beginning of the 20th century, with the so-called Edinburgh Conference. It continues until our days. It marked a new era. Now different Christian groups see each other, look at each other, not from the perspective of hostility, of confessionalism, of our differences, but we try to look at each other from the perspective of the Church's unity. This is a great achievement, and this is a huge task that the modern ecumenical movement tries to achieve. However, there were ecumenical movements even before the modern ecumenical movement. As a matter of fact, all the occurrences of the Christian divisions immediately triggered contemporary ecumenical movements, the movements towards rapprochement between the fragments of Christianity. There were ecumenical movements before the modern ecumenical movement, starting with the earliest ones in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and so forth centuries. they are understudied, and we need to study them more. My point is that ecumenical movement is concurrent with the schisms in the church. It is concurrent because it reflects exactly this essential feature of the church of being one. Oneness of the church means effort of church's members to contribute to the restoration of unity, something that all of us are supposed to do.